I don't think, particularly in this sector, AI is a job destroyer. It will change roles in a good way.
What happens when you free up all of that professional time?
We don't have enough skilled professional people in the sector. If we can free up time, this is not about getting rid of people. It's saying, thank God we now have technology to make sure we can do the work that we need to do. But really embrace it and just get involved. Try and make sure that there's the bandwidth within your organization to actually pilot some stuff, get involved. I personally dislike the word PropTech. I don't think there's been a good culture around the way we curate and collect data. The crux of it comes to, we've got lots of bits of paper that we need to turn into structured data. Not only do we need to digitize, but do we need to rethink how we do stuff? How can we measure some ROI here? People will need to trust this technology. If you don't have good data, it's still garbage in, garbage out.
Hello, welcome to Bricks, Bytes and Bold Moves, the future of real estate. We're joined today by Andrew Knight, who is the global lead in AI, data and technology at RICS, and has the wonderful position of seeing almost all of the technology that intersects with surveying and real estate. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
So I'd love to dive in and hear what real estate means to you and how you started in the industry. What's your story with the bricks?
That's interesting. I mean, there's two questions there. I guess I'll ask the first one about how I got involved. I'm not a surveyor by trade. I did an earth sciences degree a very, very long time ago. And for a lot of my career, I was in a more kind of general commercial environment rather than a professional body, but really steeped in data and technology from a very early day. If any of our listeners can remember what a punch card is, then you'll probably be able to date me in a kind of carbon dating way. But I've been with RICS for nearly 14 years now, and it's almost impossible not to, by osmosis, get an awful lot of information into your head around what we mean by surveying. And I think in terms of that question about what does it mean to me, it's actually incredibly broad church, and it's something that I talk about on my podcasts and videos, that our members, 100,000 odd worldwide, work right across the property and built environment life cycle. So I personally dislike the word PropTech because for me it's a bit narrow, because our members are working across land use, construction, brokerage, valuation, property management, finance, really the whole life cycle across all the different asset types. So it's an incredibly broad area. Rather than just people thinking about one particular part thereof.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I really like about property is how it intersects with so many industries. The big ones, of course, being finance, construction, law, but there's so many others in so many different ways.
Exactly, and I think that's why it's so exciting that what data and technology has the potential to do, because there are so many, almost hundreds of use cases that we can apply technology to.
I feel like I can't leave you mentioning you don't like the word PropTech without inviting suggestions for better names.
Well, I guess the reason I don't like it is I think, on the one hand, it's been a necessary, I'll use the word evil here in the sense it's been a buzzword to kind of capture the kind of innovation and, to a degree, disruption that's been brought outside into a sector that can be perhaps criticised for being a bit conservative in terms of its change. I guess the reason I dislike it is I think in the future I would hope it has to disappear, because we will have a sector that simply uses data and technology and AI in a mature way with a supply chain, but also homegrown organic IT, like every other sector. I mean, I was writing manufacturing systems back in the 80s, and we've never had the word manutech. We've always had a sector that's adopted technology and arguably ahead of real estate in all its forms. So I'm hoping that the word PropTech can go away. And also, I think back to my point earlier about the depth and breadth of certainly what our ICS members get involved in, there's a danger that PropTech kind of crowds out the other kind of use cases, the other part of the property life cycle. For some people, PropTech is quite a narrow word.
Yeah. Say more about that. That's an interesting idea.
Well, I think it's because, often people think about built assets and think about property technology being around those existing assets, where I'm thinking more broadly around, AI and data and tech helping with land use, with planning and development, with, end of life, with more kind of holistic approaches around sustainability. So for me, it's about having a broader look at the impact of AI, data and tech. And, if you talk to somebody, particularly in the construction sector, they'll be quite protective in the sense they want to talk about construction technology, Contech.
Yes, yeah.
And there's also that kind of bleed into, law tech, fintech, where these big kind of technologies begin to blur a bit. So I prefer to talk about this general AI, data and technology across the built and natural environment.
That makes sense. And I definitely recognize some of those kind of limitations of sort of wanting to maybe just box your technology as a better check-in system or a better way to manage access cards. But I guess what you're talking about here, Andrew, is what's the opportunity for a better built place, like building better buildings, better land use, more sustainable land use, that more like holistic opportunity, the bigger play, I guess.
I think it is, and I think some of that goes back to the root cause that I talk a lot about in terms of how the sector can really reap the rewards of AI, data and tech, is that middle word data, that in an ideal world we have data that is there around land and built assets right across that life cycle. And one of the challenges at the moment is we have a sector that's quite siloed, handovers between different disciplines, and what we don't have is a good data set around the assets and the land that we want to be custodians of. And so that's one of the big challenges for the sector, is having that birth to death, or cyclical in a good way of managing land and property, and having the digital data to support that.
Why do you think we haven't got that yet?
I don't think there's been a good culture around the way we curate and collect data. I think also we have had various handover points between architect to constructor to occupier, valuer, all those different disciplines that look after assets over their life cycle. And so you've had those kind of fall-offs of information. I was at a conference recently, and it's a podcast, but there was a lovely kind of sawtooth picture that somebody brought up to indicate how you gather data, and then the data collapses and is lost as you pass it from one discipline to the next. And
was that about data aging and things changing, or just it was lost in translation?
Just lost, not even translation, just not handed across, just lost.
Okay, I see.
Because
just literally thrown in the bin.
Yeah, or just metaphorically left by the roadside in that way. And I think also we've not really had, and it's not that the sector has to turn into data scientists per se, but I don't think we've had a culture of the discipline of managing standardized data in the way that other sectors have. I'm going to go back to my experience back in the 80s of writing manufacturing systems. I worked on a module around manufacturing resource planning, and that's a very disciplined area where you need a structured data set, where you can do very clever analytics and prediction, but you need structured data. And the real estate world in all its forms is still very document based.
Yes.
We still work off bits of paper. They may be digitized in some form, but we have leases, we have construction contracts, we have valuation reports, and squirreled away in those are elements of structured data, as you know very well. But we're a very document driven sector. And also, dare I say, in certain parts of the sector, there are market drivers. There are, to be blunt, there are issues around information asymmetry where it's useful for people not to share information.
Yeah, of course. The document problem resonates. It's been a big feature of my career, working and building kind of data science driven technology. There's normally something hidden in a document. I mean, it's kind of why we started Fifth Dimension AI, for that purpose. I guess the thing that comes to mind is BIM, Building Information Management. And this was meant to solve all of these problems, and some time ago. But it's not something I ever really hear people in the industry talking about very much. And if I do, it's normally kind of one-off, like let's build a model of a building for a thing, like for a disposal, for a remodeling. What's happened?
Well, I think BIM has been around for a long time, and it's
How long has BIM been around? Actually,
a long time.
Yeah. I should know that.
Yeah, probably 15, 20 years in various forms. Yeah. When I was first, exposed to the concept of BIM, and I think this truth still holds true, it was explained to me as effectively all the data you would ever want to know about an asset, a building, through its life cycle. And I think for better or for worse, understandably, when you look at the dimensions of BIM, we've started that journey from the design and construction part of that journey.
Yeah.
And obviously in the UK, there was a strong BIM mandate from the government over the years. And that's driven, I think, compared to other parts of the world, a relatively high take-up of BIM from that design construction phase. Yeah. And if we look at the further dimensions of BIM that are available, there are good examples, but they're relatively few and far between, of BIM being used to move into the operational phase with so-called soft landings, where you get that design put across with all the as-built, with all the asset register into that operational phase. But I think we're a long way from having what I consider a true building information model, which is back to that document side. Do we have all the leases? Do we have all the other information in addition to that geometry, that asset register, to really have a full picture of that building, of that built asset for all the different stakeholders, for all the documentation, for all the health and safety certificates, for all the planned preventative maintenance, for all the invoices that go back and forth between, landlord and tenant. So I think we've got some part of the way, but understandably its adoption has been driven from that front end. But I guess as we look at, as you said yourself, sometimes people do retrofit a BIM model, which can be useful if you're thinking about a particular retrofit, or if you want to, address the issue of an existing asset and build, and let's perhaps not go down the rabbit hole of digital twins, but building some kind of shadow, some kind of digital shadow of an asset. So I think eventually we will end up with not so much perhaps BIM in the way people think of it now, but these digital twins, these digital shadows, where we have as much information as possible held digitally about a building. But we've got to remember that we're going to have to live with most of the assets we already have as built.
Yeah.
This is not about building new buildings and BIM from that context. It's almost the retrofit challenge of how do we retrofit a digital twin, a digital shadow on our existing assets to address all the issues we've got around sustainability and net zero and just managing them better from an asset management perspective.
One of the things that I always struggle with BIM is as a data person, on the one hand, I'm like, let's get all the data. Obviously, that's valuable. You almost don't need to justify it. It's clearly valuable having all this data about these assets. But then my kind of product mind is, but for what? and I feel like there are use cases you hear about in isolation, but I'm not sure I've ever really been sold the dream of the sort of systemic, your entire sort of property portfolio will work better with the BIM dream achieved.
And I suppose one has to be realistic that in, particularly for commercial real estate, you need a return on investment here. So you need to see some value from the expense. And there's often quite a lot of pushback, I think, from developers on BIMing a project from day one because they don't.
Can we say that? Is BIMing a verb?
Well, I think we just created it, haven't we?
There we go.
I don't think it'll be the word of the year, but and there certainly can be pushback. Because there is more cost involved if you BIM a project from day one. But I think, if we look at some of the money that's on the table, and this leads into some of the value that AI brings in its basic sort of algorithmic form, is that, if you have building management systems, if you have the Internet of Things, if you do have a smarter building, which involves some form of digital twin type approach, there's real value there in terms of helping on that decarbonisation journey. And some of it also, if you have a relatively straightforward point cloud and you can begin to, certainly on existing assets, have a sense of the size and dimensions and where assets are, it can make the whole maintenance cycle much, much more effective. So I think one can be quite brutal about saying there is a return on investment if you produce some kind of digital twin.
Yeah.
And if you think of from a kind of an asset portfolio management point of view, if you have lots of assets, you need to know where are they, what are they, how big are they, what are the kind of reporting that you can get from it from a sustainability point of view, from energy management, and from a kind of a landlord and tenant perspective. You want to have a good, digital equivalent of all that landlord and tenant information.
Yeah, the point you make there about cost of entry, I think is really important, and also it intersects with AI, particularly generative AI, because one of the things that we'll see over the coming years, and it's something we've been doing a lot of work on, is reducing the cost of getting your documents and your data into some kind of structured format. And over time, the availability of that kind of now hidden unstructured data is going to increase, and the cost of getting it is going to decrease, which, whilst you said you didn't want to talk about digital twins, we seem to be there, which presumably changes some of the calculation on ROI here.
I think it does, and almost more broadly across the sector. And perhaps I'm sounding too optimistic in what I'm about to say, but I do think one of the big challenges, and I've been speaking about this well before the advent of Gen AI, is this whole documents to data problem. That the sector, if we think about the residential world and buying and selling, so much information is still held effectively on a paper format, whether it's a title report that might come to you on a PDF, that's still a piece of paper. And I think so many of the use cases that we want to leverage to make real estate more efficient, more productive, more decarbonised, the crux of it comes to we've got lots of bits of paper that we need to turn into structured data. But critically, we need to be able to trust how that process has worked. So I think you're right, the kind of cost element of, turning thousands of documents into structured data does need to be addressed, because we do come back to the fact that everybody needs real estate to perform financially.
Yeah.
And if there's a barrier cost-wise, particularly if we think, we're recording this podcast in, the City of London with lots of shiny buildings in, and there's a lot more investment that can go into those. But I'm always very mindful, given my role at RICS, of this long tail of assets where there is, to be blunt, less money around to retrofit both digitally and physically. So we've got to be thinking, how can we cost effectively help asset managers with a long tail of less, shiny buildings, if I can use that phrase, still address all these issues.
Yeah, there's some big challenges there, right? One thing I'm thinking about here is what we've kind of talked broadly about some of the space and some of the concepts and touched on BIM and digital twins. Where do you see exciting things happening at the moment? And I think what I'm always interested in, and our listeners are interested in, is as much specificity as possible. Where do you see some really promising signs of what we've just been talking about becoming real?
It's funny. People sort of talk about excitement, and they want to kind of see almost science fiction and things being produced that are incredibly kind of, it's an old film, but kind of the kind of, I don't know, that sort of going back to Blade Runner type sort of level of looking ahead in the future. Whereas for me, the really exciting stuff is actually how AI, particularly now with the Gen AI revolution, can automate the kind of repetitive, dull tasks that actually leave property professionals with much more time to do the high value stuff. There's a wonderful meme that I've stolen off the internet in some of the presentations I do about, I don't want AI to write movies or write novels. I want it to do the laundry. It's about actually the excitement of the productivity gains we can see. So for me, the excitement is, and there are some, very specific, exciting things where you can use, predictive AI to do some really sort of number crunching scheduling of really complex construction projects, which, no human mind could do quickly enough and go through all the possibilities. But for me, and you talked about specificity, I can't even say it,
Tough word,
being specific,
yeah.
It's things about, the summarizing planning documents, reading leases, extracting information from long, I'm going to use the word tedious documents to some extent. I read some statistic about it's an extreme example, but the Lower Thames Crossing having millions and millions of pages in all the various reports. But better than I do, that there are many parts of the property life cycle where there's a lot of documentation to absorb, both as part of that life cycle, but also then as a kind of digital twin. So for me, the exciting stuff is document retrieval, helping people summarize lots of documents, long documents, helping them read leases. And there will be a balancing piece here, because people will need to trust this technology to make sure they can rely on it. But for me, it's the wading through. It's also, from a data science perspective, it's aggregating data sets, it's cleaning data sets up. There are already a lot of use cases in terms of automated valuation, which has its role for certain use cases. So I think where there's real value is in use case by use case, document to data, but also where we do have data, really powerful analytics that human beings wouldn't be able to do. Really powerful stuff around locational data to give us an idea of the trajectory of, whether certain parts of a city are going up or going down in value, helping people with looking at, footfall and the way they can plan the kind of tenants they have in a big shopping centre based on footfall and demographics. You can crunch some numbers there from various data sources that are really, really powerful.
So one of the things that comes to mind there, and I totally agree with real estate's laundry. And you had some good examples there, like extracting information from leases is a great one. I wonder about the more agentic workflows. So when I say that, I'm thinking about, just because the use cases you described there are a sort of one step. They're like, I need some information from some documents or from a lease. I think the analysis one is a bit more multi-step. But the really interesting, I'd say, cutting edge applications of generative AI right now are where you can take a workflow and actually stitch together multiple different steps to get a bit further and add a bit more. So I guess an example of that might be maybe you need to know the break clauses across a whole portfolio of leases, and maybe there's 50 leases, and actually in the background you need an agent that's going to review every single lease, extract the data, do some analysis on it, and give you an initial draft for you to then start working with. I guess how have you seen many of those agentic kind of workflows yet? And what do you, when I talk about that, where does your mind go? Are you like excitement or concern or somewhere in between?
I think it's not so much neither excitement nor concern. I think that is the logical next step. The reason there's probably a hesitation in my voice is I think the sector is still finding its way, and it has different levels of ambition. And as you know, it's a very fragmented sector with some large players and then a whole long tail of smaller ones. So people are beginning to feel their way about the art of the possible. I'll go back to that ROI area where they want to perhaps try something initially and see whether they get an ROI and justify the expense, and then they can scale up from that. And I think, in previous sectors, we've seen plenty of examples of people trying to boil the ocean and digitize their whole operation not overnight, but in one big project, and that being expensive and never working. So there is a good case for taking this step by step. I think the other issue for me is the danger of, and I think hopefully we will avoid this, but simply digitizing a poor process and having a poor digital process at the end. And I think the opportunity here is to rethink in a classic sort of business analysis case, are we doing the right process in the first place? Or is there an opportunity here to reimagine how we manage property and how we do, as you say, those kind of multi-step processes, and look really closely about, well, actually, are we even analyzing it in the right way?
Yes.
Is there a way to reimagine? And it sounds a bit cliche, but is there a way to reimagine the way we do portfolio analysis, for example? Are we looking at the right data points? So I think that there's a bigger picture here about the sector stepping back a bit and thinking, not only do we need to digitize, but do we need to rethink how we do stuff? Because the danger is we simply digitize a poor set of processes that are siloed and aren't connected to perhaps other data sources or other factors.
Where do you think that learning comes from versus, how much of that learning do you think can be kind of thought up and pre-designed versus, and I appreciate we may have a difference here given our background and organizations, but how much of that do you think is about kind of discovery and more kind of those pushing the barriers, kind of creating these new processes and then being adopted versus kind of design first?
I think for me, this is where we need a real hybrid of people who understand real estate and our data scientists to work together, because I think, it is an idiosyncratic world, the built-in natural environment. There are lots of use cases, lots of different asset types. There are jurisdictional challenges in terms of statute and custom and practice. So I think for me, the opportunity is forward-thinking, innovative people in the sector working with data scientists to say, actually, this is the status quo. I know we can do this better. I need your technical input, but I can help you with some of the idiosyncratic things about the way the sector works. Because I remember an example years ago where a chief exec of a REIT was talking about how a PropTech firm had come in to pitch to him, and by the end of it, he was having to explain to them what a rent review was. So that there was still that sort of slight disconnect sometimes about technical people building things because they can, and then bumping into some real realities.
It's a very common trap. One thing there, I would maybe swap the word data scientist for AI engineer.
I for me, that's a kind of a vague term I use about somebody who gets the technology and can make things happen, but isn't necessarily steeped in the idiosyncratic nature of real estate.
Yes.
And I guess another point I'd make is that you would perhaps look at perhaps a large player in the real estate world and think, well, actually, is your org structure the right shape for perhaps a reimagined process? Because
that's a very good question.
You do have silos within silos. I've talked about the fact the sector itself is kind of siloed across the whole life cycle. But there's an argument that once again it's a sector that's been quite traditional in the way they structure themselves, and there's probably a question mark about, okay, well, do we need to look at perhaps more cross-disciplinary, more kind of holistic type roles which look across assets in a less siloed way?
Which begs the question, I guess, of what's that look like over the last 14 years you've been at RICS? So I'd love, because we've seen a huge change in technology in the last, even though we talk about real estate being slow to adopt some technologies, there's been a huge shift in the daily working practices over the last 14 years.
I think there has. And there hasn't. I mean, the
Right.
sector still,
Yeah.
if there was a plug in this room and we could unplug Word and Excel, I think there would be a sharp intake of breath across the sector. So we're still very reliant on a set of tools. I think certainly a number of firms I know have been very innovative and are doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But it's still, I think, in many respects, early days. And I think particularly about the fact that it's still a very kind of people-driven sector in many respects. There's still a lot of existing practices and ways of doing things which are, I think, not so much resistant to change, but just will take time.
Yeah.
And I think I come back to the fact that it's still a very fragmented sector. There's still many, many tiers, whether you're in construction or property management, whatever it will be. And so that'll take time to kind of percolate down across the tiers and across the sector more broadly.
I guess I'm wondering whether there's things, I'm putting you on the spot for specifics here, but whether there's things that you can think of that have changed the structure of businesses during your time at Rix.
I think you can certainly see where BIM has been used.
Yeah.
That certainly has changed the way people do things, and undoubtedly in one particular piece. If I think of the valuation arena, and this almost, to some extent, depending on your pedantic definition of AI, is almost about statistics as much as AI. But we've certainly seen in certain economies a situation where you have statistical models or machine learning doing valuation for mortgage origination and remortgage in the residential market, to the extent that probably 30, 40, 50% of properties are valued using an AVM of some form.
Yes.
So you see that a real significant disruption or innovation, depending where you're standing, in how we actually assess the value.
Yeah.
And similarly in the capital markets, if you're looking at a portfolio of non-performing loans or a real estate owned portfolio, you will do that kind of automation to look at the value, and you'll be using either some kind of hedonic statistical model or indeed machine learning. Same with mass appraisal. So we're beginning to see that quite large scale, but ironically it comes back to the question of data. If you don't have good data, it's still garbage in, garbage out.
That is one of the challenges, one of the many challenges. I'd love to focus in a bit more on your personal journey working with generative AI. One of the wonderful things about the technology is it's so freely available compared to previous, if we think about previous technology, it's taken a while to filter out, but actually most consumers have access to cutting edge foundational kind of AI models on their phones, whether they ask to or not in many cases, which is a different conversation. But I feel like everyone I talk to with generative AI has had some kind of aha moment of, oh my gosh, this is not what I expect from a computer, a kind of jaw-dropping moment. I wonder if you've had one of those moments yourself, and if you could share.
For me, there's a lot to unbundle there. I think in many, obviously, Gen AI is very
I would take, creating images of cats on a beach in the Bahamas with my children.
For me, it's been a mix. I think Gen AI for the sector has been a wonderful catalyst, as well as being a very useful tool. It's got AI into the public, both from a consumer perspective and a business perspective, in a way that's been terribly healthy, because it's made the sector wake up and think, yes, AI has been around a long time, but we've kind of been not ignoring it, but it's been under the radar, despite how all pervasive it has been for a number of years. I worked on expert systems in the 1980s, so AI has been around a long time in various forms. For me, Gen AI, and it's not that I'm in any way cynical or doubtful of its power and efficacy. For me, it's at both times. We were joking earlier about train services and quantum mechanics. For me, Gen AI is both incredibly impressive and incredibly flawed at the same time, in the sense that actually I've used it a lot. I find it very useful for summarizing, for giving me a starter for 10 on various tasks that I do. But in the back of my mind, I also know it can make incredibly dumb things come out when you type in a prompt. And I know you're working very hard to do some really good, trustable AI here in what you're doing. And that's really critical, because we're in a sector where we have to rely on the output of whatever we get, whether it's a statistical model for evaluation or whether it's Gen AI summarizing a planning document for us. We've got to then relay that as professionals with reliance to our clients. So for me, it's been a wonderful journey of, this is an incredibly powerful tool, but I still need to make sure I check and understand what I'm going to use from that tool before I then use it for consumption by an outside party. So it's been a funny mix of being terribly impressed, but also knowing that I need to still have that professional skepticism before I use it for anything serious, if I can use that phrase.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I think as well, there's an element there of using kind of broad consumer-focused tools like ChatGPT or maybe Gemini or something like that, which are designed with everyone in mind.
Exactly.
To do very specialist work has variable outcomes, I guess, which is one of the challenges, isn't it?
I mean, for me, the exciting piece is the combination of the power of these foundational models, large language models, with that, the RAG approach, getting your kind of trusted archive of documents that you can then cite, that you can go back to if you need to. So for me, it's about almost the next generation of saying, okay, how do we then turn these kind of great starter for tens, these wonderfully, democratized tools, how do we overcome some of the security issues around information, and also how do we then overlay that context-specific set of documents so that we can really trust and rely on the output?
Yes, absolutely. And surfacing, there's many analogies to humans, surfacing the right information and the right data and the right documents for the right request is one of the key parts of building any kind of Gen AI system. And I think one of the things most people underestimate when going from demo and prototype to production grade system. Because I think one of the fascinating things about the technology is the barrier now to make something that looks good and works 50% of the time is very, very, very low. But the barrier to get to something that an enterprise can use or a professional can use, which is 95, 97, 98, 99% of the time. I'm a data person, so I can't use the word, I can't believe in 100% accuracy. It is huge and requires a huge amount of kind of technology expertise and understanding the technology, which is new. I wonder what your day-to-day use of Gen AI tools looks like. Do you have a favorite?
I suppose I bounce back between Claude and ChatGPT. And I don't, I'm not a practitioner in the sense I'm not using it to produce evidence that I would then rely on. I'm not reading leases. I'm not trying to be a planning developer. So I'm using it with a degree of curiosity, but also a degree of desk research. I'll think, okay, I need to research something here. I need a starter for 10 perhaps for a presentation, or I'm writing a paper. So I'd like some hints and tips. So I use it as almost part of my work input.
Yes, that makes perfect sense.
Somebody described it to me a couple of years ago, or maybe 18 months ago. It's a bit like having a free intern, which sounds a bit rude about interns, but it's that useful thing about, okay, where do I even start? Just give me some information here, and please cite me some sources if you can, so I can at least just satisfy myself that I can perhaps dig a bit deeper and look at some of the original sources you've quoted there. So I use it for that. It's been a powerful tool for me to kind of explain what I present to members of our ICS, to give them an idea of, as I've discussed before, the kind of the pros and cons, that it's very powerful, but at the same time it can also make some pretty schoolboy errors, because I still do need to get across to many members that the sense of the probabilistic nature of so much of AI, and that actually it is still mimicking, for better or for worse, how human thinks. And on a good day, that's probably good that it's only mimicking what we do, because one could argue that humans are the worst black boxes ever at explaining how they come to a conclusion. But I think it's about understanding how it does differ from human intelligence, and that sometimes can be a benefit and sometimes can be a downside. But it's a very useful way, I think, of, for me, demonstrating to people it's the pros and cons, and as you've said, also highlighting the fact that actually to really get it to the level of accuracy that you want, comparable to a human, is a lot more work and takes a lot more thought and investment of time.
Although I would observe that humans are much less accurate than we generally believe. Some humans are very accurate. Having spent most of my career looking at human-generated data, I feel like one of the really interesting mental barriers we have in the industry for technology adoption is overestimating the quality of the human-generated data or human-generated documents we have today.
I would agree. I mean, I think, as you know, you're reaching levels of accuracy on something like, lease abstraction, which is, on a par with somebody on a good day who's had a reasonable amount of coffee and is awake. And I think, but that, I think
maybe
also,
they weren't woken up at 2 a.m. by their daughter,
But that also talks to the fact that you still need peer review. You still need, you still need guardrails about saying, okay, well, either my colleague has read the lease or Gen AI has.
Yeah.
If I'm going to sign that off, we'll still need to do some kind of due diligence. So I think you're right. We've reached the level in many cases where we can rely on AI in the same way that we could rely on a human, but that's probably still not 100% of what a practitioner would want in terms of perhaps giving final advice.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's what the sort of a philosophy I'm very focused on, which is the human-centric answer to AI, right? Especially as there's things that generative AI models are very, very good at that humans are not, and there are things that they are very, very bad at that humans are good at. And the classical example is counting the number of letters in words or things like that. And the reason that's almost impossible for a model to do is because the way the words are cut up is not the way humans read them, and various other. And that kind of, the reality is that if you can combine the kind of best of human expertise with thoughtful kind of intelligent product that's focused on, hey, we know humans are great at this, we know there's expertise here, let's surface the right information in the right way with the right analysis and make it kind of traceable, that I think gives you the optimum opportunity right now. As well as you say, what happens when you free up all of that professional time?
Yeah.
Like, that's a huge opportunity for the build place.
Yeah.
We were talking to a valuation business earlier in the week who were, every hour we can free up of their valuers is hours that can be spent doing the fee earning work. That's their focus. That's their core business.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that message. Back to that message of, I don't want it to do I don't want it to write a book. I want it to do the laundry. It's about understanding which task, and I think augmentation is that, for me, the key word. That this is AI working hand in hand with human beings.
Yeah.
I think one concern I do have, and I do mention this a lot when I talk to the profession more widely, is making sure that we don't de-skill the next generation. If you're going to critique what your AI model has extracted from a lease, you need to understand how leases work and how they're written, and you still need to have the foundational skill set to manage the output of these models. So let's make sure we don't lose that kind of professional expertise. It's not that people need to spend their lives reading leases, but they need to have that base knowledge, that foundational knowledge, to be able to effectively critique what comes out of a model.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's not a replacement for deep expertise, especially in specific domains, right?
And also, I think the other sort of positive argument, as well as augmentation, is that I speak to so many people in the sector who express the fact that we don't have enough skilled professional people in the sector.
Yes,
so if we can free up time, this is not about getting rid of people. It's saying, thank God we now have technology to make sure we can do the work that we need to do with the amount of people that are available. Yeah,
I've yet to meet the practice that isn't struggling with finding the right people and the right skill sets. It's a wider problem too, of course, because we have an aging population. Our working age population is declining. We need that boost because we'll have less people to do less things. Exactly. So I think that there's obviously the sort of the risk of shouting fire in a crowded cinema, but I don't think particularly in this sector AI is a job destroyer. It will change roles in a good way, but as you intimated earlier, this is about freeing up people to do the higher value, fee earning, more interesting work. To be honest. Yeah. I guess when you obviously spend a lot of your time talking to both deep kind of experts in real estate, the property professionals, and those in the wider ecosystem. What's the general sentiment of the people you speak to about technology right now? What are they excited about? What are they worried about?
I think there's a degree of nervousness because and the risk of labouring the point. Obviously, many parts of the sector are still quite conservative and aren't necessarily that tech savvy. A lot of our members, the majority, work for SMEs and smaller businesses, or perhaps local government where there aren't necessarily the kind of R&D departments in that sense. So I think there's a degree of uncertainty and nervousness because it's an unknown quantity. So from that point of view, we're still on a long journey. We've talked a lot about the challenges around data and the fact that data can be hard to find in a manner that can be consumed by AI. So that there are a lot of challenges. I think there is a big sense that with the other kind of challenges going on in the real estate sector, we think of the office sector post-pandemic, all the different challenges around decarbonisation. There is a broader sense, I think, that technology is part of the solution to some of these challenges, and we need to use it. We do a yearly survey of all the tech partners that I work with in that kind of ecosystem, and there is still this ROI question, the ability to show a demonstrable return on investment for what might be quite a modest investment in technology. So from that point of view, our members are working in an environment where they have to run profitable businesses. So it has to become a technology in all its forms, whether it's AI or more broadly technology for the sector, technology that can be shown to produce financial returns in a relatively, hopefully, short period of time. So the ROI question is there. We've got to show that this actually does save time, make money, save money, all the normal things.
It's interesting on that, because for some organizations, I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg there, because if you're not working in a structured way with much measurement, you're not necessarily aware of what you're spending in terms of time, attention, costs. So measuring ROI for some can be very tricky, of course, can't it?
I guess that I'd almost put the challenge
Some
back
people, I feel like a vibes-based ROI, right? This feels good. No,
yeah, I suppose that I would put the challenge on to, and I know I don't like the word, that the PropTech world, to understand that actually they've got to be, that hybrid of technical, AI data scientists, whatever we call it, but they've also got to be business people. They've got to understand how to help a client measure the ROI. You're right, there'll be organizations that aren't really very good at that and won't have a really kind of clear understanding of how to do a kind of benefits realization piece. But I think that does come down to the fact that if you're a PropTech firm selling into the sector, not only do you need to build the right technology and know about the sector, but you've probably got to help them understand, how can we measure some ROI here?
It's a great question. It's something we do a lot of. And I think the thing that comes to mind for me is there's a lot of kind of tiny use cases or small use cases, let's say, like summarization, that are valuable and useful and pass the vibes ROI check. But if you really want a sort of compelling business case that your CFO is going to pat you on the back for, you need to go for your bigger, gnarlier, more difficult document-heavy processes, whether that's audit or extracting data from documents at scale, or analysis of offering memoranda. Those kind of big core to your business processes, which also align to actual business outcomes, what people want to get done. I always feel like it's so easy to build technology for stuff people don't care about, which is terrible, because then you don't get engagement, you're not adding the value people want, et cetera, et cetera. One thing I guess I would love you to kind of share is what your advice for real estate professionals is right now. There's a lot of change in the world, there's a lot of change in technology. What are the practical things you tell the people you present to about technology and what's changing? What would you implore them to do?
I'd implore them to, if they have the bandwidth, learn about it and just get their knowledge, play with the tools in a safe way, but really embrace it and just get involved. I'm a big believer in kind of experiential learning. There comes a point where, was that 70-20-10 thing, where you learn a certain amount on a course or whatever, but really you learn 70% of your knowledge by doing stuff. So try and make sure that there's the bandwidth within your organization to actually pilot some stuff, get involved. And yes, you may start with a very small process that doesn't have a huge ROI, but you've just got to get people aware of the potential of it. And then, as you say, in a funny way, forget about the technology. Start with business problems. As you said, that there are some gnarly ones that might give you some really big returns on investment in terms of how you decide on what to acquire or dispose of, or which ones to retrofit, the decisions you make about the kind of tenants you get in. There's going to be some big decisions that have big money against them, not necessarily the productivity gains of saving somebody 3 hours, but actually better outcomes in terms of decision support. So start with your business problems, not a shiny bit of technology. Because the danger is that a lot of PropTech firms have built solutions looking for a problem, whereas I think we've got to be much more focused on what are the business outcomes here, whether it's productivity gains or some big, as you said, some big gnarly problems or opportunities to make better decisions more quickly.
That seems like great advice. I guess if I was to play that back to you, it's go and experiment, go and learn by doing. And do it in a safe environment. Don't bet the business on it, but learn by doing. That's the only way I've learned anything over the years, is by actually trying to do stuff. Makes perfect sense. All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's been
Pleasure.
a great conversation, and I would look forward to seeing you in the future.
Love to come back again.
Awesome.